Thank you very much, Francisco. You told me you were going to tell people I was young and handsome.
They can see that.
Anyway, Ken Binmore told me it's my job now he said, to entertain us drunks. But, so public goods problems is what I've chosen to talk about, and they are widespread both in the social dynamics, which I'll talk much more about in terms of sharing grazing grounds and things of that sort, but also in biology. This is a termite mound, which is, after all, a public good. It's a shared quantity that everybody has to invest in. Public goods problems occur at all levels of biological organization. You heard a little bit about public goods and cancer earlier today. In fact, there's some interest, for example, in this paper, in the metabolites that cancer cells and produce, which are crucial to the development of tumors, but represent a public good. And therefore, the suggestion's been made by David Dingley and George Pacheco and others that perhaps we could deal with cancers by introducing cheaters and things of that sort, interfering with the ability to produce a public good. What are public goods? Well, the notion was introduced, I think, by Paul Samuelson, who said they are goods like clean air, which all enjoy in common in the sense that each individual's consumption does not lead to subtractions from other individuals' consumption of the good. So my enjoyment of the public good doesn't interfere with you. That distinguishes them technically from what are called common pool resources, like fisheries. You've heard a lot of discussion of public goods today. Nobody, I don't think, has mentioned common pool resources. They're really distinguished because if you take things out of a fishery, they're not available to others. But for this lecture, I'm going to lump them together because it's not really going to make a difference. The key issues I want to address, these are sort of the 4 parts of my lecture, are what can we learn from nature about how public goods problems have been dealt with? Why is discounting important? And how do we discount? What's the role of prosociality and spite? And finally, collective decision-making, collective phenomena. So these are the 4 things I want to talk about. So there's a lot of cooperation in nature. Most of the talks today were about cooperation of one sort or another. These are leafcutter ants, who are really collaborating. Public goods problems represent central challenges in evolutionary biology, and indeed the issue of making a distinction between these issues of rivalry and excludability that Samuelson has talked about and what that might mean in public goods situations in nature is a central topic not only in economics but also in evolutionary biology. Organisms produce many public goods. Information itself, of course, in collective motion, information itself is a public good. It's acquired at cost. It's beneficial to everybody. And I'll come back to that a little bit. I showed you a termite mound. A nest is a public good. Organisms produce compounds, produce structures called siderophytes that help them to chelate compounds to hold them for later use. But these compounds are held in places that others can get to them, so they become a public good. Plants fix nitrogen. That's costly, and some of the nitrogen leaks out, and it's available as a public good. Plants produce antibiotics. Antibiotics are a public good in 2 senses. In nature, they're a public good. They are compounds that plants or bacteria produce in order to poison others. But, and I'll come back to that, but if I want to take advantage of it, all I have to do is to evolve resistance to this. I don't have to produce the good if you're producing it. So it is a public good, and how is it sustained? And you know, of course, that the antibiotics are a public good in our societies as well, and the overuse of them is eroding their effectiveness. Bacteria produce extracellular polymers. Those extracellular polymers help to create a matrix for biofilms. You heard Natasha talk about biofilms earlier today. They also are signals that allow other in the group to find out how many other individuals are around. So they are crucial for quorum sensing. And so the first thing I'll talk to you about is some work that I was involved in, led by my graduate student, Carrie Nadell, together with Jally Xavier and Kevin Foster, who Kevin Foster spoke at one of these about 2 years ago, I think. And we wanted to understand what are the conditions under which these extracellular polymers that are so valuable to the biofilm would be produced. So the idea is that organisms produce these extracellular polymers, creating what the technical term is slime. And ultimately, this leads to biofilms. So not all organisms do this the same. Some of them can't make the polymer at all. Some of them make the polymer constitutively, they have to. And some of them do it only when the signal tells them that population densities are high enough or low enough. So Pseudomonas aeruginosa produces it only at high cell densities, whereas Vibrio cholera, which is the organism that's responsible for cholera, actually turns on the slime at low cell density. So what are the conditions that select for this? So we did this, which means they, built a model that looked at competition between these types under varying conditions of spatial relations and put them into competition, allowed the material to drip down from the top, and looked at the competitive interactions and asked under what conditions we would select for constitutive slime producers, under what conditions we would select for those that produced only at high densities, et cetera. And again, as you've heard several times today, space turns out to be very important here. This is all summarized in a paper that's just come out that I'm not involved with, involving some of the same authors. How do you solve the public goods dilemma in bacterial biofilms? And a lot of it has to do with the flow rates and the nearest neighbor relationships among the different types. But the prototypical public goods problem is the commons we all share. And this was an idea that was originally introduced 2 centuries ago by William Forster Lloyd. He talked about the common grazing grounds that benefited everybody, but nobody had sufficient interest by themselves to sustain. How were these sustained? And then years later, in the 1950s, Garrett Hardin talked about the tragedy of the commons. Hardin went back and found Forster Lloyd's paper, and he talked about the solution, which was mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon. And then Lynn Ostrom, who just passed away in the past year, really put this to work and showed how small fishing communities could self-organize in order to regulate the utilization of the commons and find cooperation. Globally, we are eroding our public goods. We're overusing them, and there are several reasons for that. One is because we discount. We discount the future, and we discount the interests of others. This is, I'm afraid, what our future holds if has its way. So the first thing I want to talk about, therefore, is discounting. How has evolution, I'm not going to answer this question, shaped our personal and societal discount rates? I was actually involved in a meeting some years ago that tried to address this question, and we got nowhere. And how has evolution shaped our concern for others, what's called in the economics literature prosociality? And how has evolution shaped collective behavior and organisms coming together to share information, and ultimately the emergence of societies? Now, discounting is key to public goods problem. It's key to how societies and individuals value the future. It's key to cooperation. In evolutionary biology, one of the fundamental notions is the so-called reproductive value. That is the expected future contribution of an organism of age X to population growth in the future. And all this complicated formula says, I only want you to focus on this term here, but all this says is we will compute for an individual of age x, going out from x to infinity, how many offspring it's going to have at various times in the future, but discounted by when you have them. The sooner you have them in a growing population, the more valuable they are. And so the discount rate becomes very important there. It's not usually called the discount rate in evolutionary biology, but you do discount the future contributions. But in that sense, the evolutionary discount rate is very similar to accounting for the time value of money. In a growing population, anything that you get now is worth more than you're going to get it later. So the Darwinian perspective would ask, how have individual discount rates evolved and how have societal discount rates evolved? So as I said, it's key to how individuals and societies value the future. And the simplest assumption, the one we all think of, is exponential discounting. That says that the payoff B that's going to occur t time steps in the future is worth B times e to the minus delta t compared to what it would be if it was produced today. And so the present value is, if you have a stream of benefits, is going to be the integral B of t times e to the minus delta t minus t, discounting off into the future. But there's a lot of evidence that we don't discount at constant rates, and societies certainly don't discount at constant rates. There is a time-dependent discount rate. We discount typically the short term at a higher rate than we discount the future. And there are experiments with birds, there are experiments certainly with people that demonstrate that. The most common form is called hyperbolic discounting. It's a form of this sort. And in fact, the term hyperbolic discounting is often sloppily applied to any sort of discounting that discounts the near term more than the far term. So what are the consequences of hyperbolic discounting, and why do we do it? Well, one of the consequences is it leads to intertemporal inconsistency. I'm an expert on that. I wake up in the morning and I say, when it comes to dinner tonight, I'm not going to have dessert. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do that. And then dinner time comes and I think, well, tomorrow is another day and I'll worry about this tomorrow. And the reason I do that, I think, is because in the evening, like right now, when I think about the next few hours, I'm using a higher discount rate than I did when I thought about that same time period in the morning. And that's a consequence of having a hyperbolic discounting. Now, this leads to some paradoxes, because if I know I'm going to do that in the morning, then I might take steps like not going to dinner or taking some pill that's going to make me sick in the evening. So there's really a philosophical problem here that I'll leave to Brian, which is the conflict between who am I really? I've been wondering. Now, what are the explanations for hyperbolic discounting? Well, there are a number, but the simplest place to start is if you take a bunch of exponential discount curves and just add them together or average them, you get something that looks hyperbolic, or at least it looks sloppily hyperbolic. That is, the near term is discounted at a higher rate. So why is that relevant? Well, suppose I'm trying to make a decision. I'm really weighing conflicting objectives. So I'm voting myself. And I'm averaging together different discount curves that I have for different sorts of phenomena. In fact, these may be associated with different regions of the brain. And I don't know enough to get into this, but the question of if these represent different regions of the brain, were these independent evolutionary events, or could this have all evolved as a yin-yang package? For similar reasons, societies discount hyperbolically. Marty Weitzman has a paper called Gamma Discounting, where he points this out. And what he says is the main finding is that even if every individual believes in a constant discount rate, the widespread of opinion is going to give you something that looks, well, he calls it gamma discounting, but essentially it looks hyperbolic. The effective social discount rate will decline significantly over time. So societies, if they vote, are likely to discount hyperbolically. those are sort of the proximate explanations. The ultimate explanation goes back, I think, to, but Ken knows more about this than I do, a paper of Suzu, who says it's because the value of a future reward should be discounted where there's a risk that the reward will not be realized. So, so if I offer you $100 now or $200 next year, you might be smart to take the $100 now because you don't know if I'll deliver next year. But this applies to any kind of discounting, of course. Maskin and Dasgupta published a paper a few years ago. This paper actually arose out of or about the time of the meeting I attended where we tried to wrestle with this problem. It says the uncertain realization of when the payoffs are going to come will lead, that level of uncertainty will lead to hyperbolic discounting. I think a simpler explanation is that it has a lot to do with bounded rationality. That is, if you try and distinguish between two events that are occurring now or 10 minutes from now, that's meaningful to you. But if I say I'm going to give you this a year from now or a year and 10 minutes from now, that doesn't mean anything. We don't distinguish between that, and I think we don't distinguish between that because we haven't developed the ability to do it. Uncertainty contributes to that. But because of that, we treat events off in the far future that are the same distance apart differently than we will when we approach them. I've talked about learning from nature. I've talked about discounting. I want to turn now to thinking about prosociality and spite. Spite was my assigned topic, but I didn't know enough about it to talk for the full time. So going to the expert, Dr. Wikipedia, says prosocial behavior is caring about the welfare of rights of others. And the implication is caring about them maybe even at cost to yourself, putting it into your calculations. I'm going to extend that concept so not only to feeling this, but to mechanisms that have selected for behaviors that benefit others, even if I'm talking about plants or microorganisms. And spite I'm going to think of as negative prosociality, things like root competition, shading out other plants, and the production of allelic chemics. Those are the antibiotics, for example, chemicals that poison others, are all, they're not done spitefully, but they're all mechanisms that have evolved to harm others, ultimately because there's going to be some benefit to you. Now, the puzzle of prosociality is not the same as altruism, but it's closely related to altruism. And altruism is something that Darwin worried about. It delayed the publication of The Origin of Species for 20 years while he tried to work it out and never really did. Then we thought we had it worked out. Haldane is reported to have said, although Hamilton disputed this, that he would lay down his life for 2 siblings or 8 cousins, having apparently made the calculation of the degree of relatedness. Hamilton, of course, is the one who really worked out much of the mathematics in his back-to-back papers in the 1960s, where his major concern were the haplodiploid insects, which have a higher degree of relatedness because the males come from unfertilized eggs, so the females are related by 3/4, and that made it easier to understand why an individual would give up her own fitness to help a sister. Now, this has become a highly debated topic, and I certainly don't want to get into this now, because without question, whether genetic relatedness is important or not, it's not the only way. It's not essential for cooperation. We've already heard discussion about, in fact, in the last lecture, about reciprocal altruism, cooperative agreements among individuals that can facilitate what passes for altruism. And it doesn't have to be individuals you recognize. Spatially limited interactions can facilitate cooperation. Again, you've heard about that in the earlier lectures. Martin Novak and Bob May published a paper on this in the early 90s, and Rick Durrett, and this comes from a paper that Rick Durrett and I did, in which we simply looked at competition between a cooperator and a defector, but where the defector would normally win, but this was now on a grid. And on the grid, what happens is that In regions where there is by chance a large number of cooperators to begin with, they all benefit from that, so cooperation spreads. The localization of interactions can benefit the spread of cooperation. So that's useful. Tightening feedback loops can, in this way, through local control, can enhance cooperation, but it's not enough because it can also work the other way. Tight feedback loops can also mean I can control my local environment, so it can foster greed and selfish behavior and spite. An example, bacteria produce toxins, I've already talked about them, to which they are immune. Lin Chow and Bruce Levin published a paper some years ago looking at the production of a chemical called collicin by E. coli. What collicin does is to poison other individuals who are not producers and are not resistant to it. But when they tried to evolve this under well-mixed conditions in the laboratory, they couldn't do it because what kept arising were mutants that didn't bother to pay the price of producing the toxin, but did develop resistance to it. But this created a very interesting non-hierarchical competition scheme because the collicin producers could outcompete the wild types, but the collicin-resistant types that don't produce it are paying a lower cost, and the collicin producers have no advantage over them, so they outcompeted the collicin producers. But these guys have to pay a price just to have the resistance. So in head-to-head competition with the wild type, they lose out. So A defeats B, B defeats C, and C defeats A. But eventually the system crashed. But if they put this on a grid, instead of in a well-mixed medium, they began to see the emergence of collicin producers. So Rick Durrett and I modeled this in a paper in, I don't remember what year, sometime in the 1990s, in which we built a spatially explicit model where individuals only interacted locally, and we showed that all three types could coexist in a relatively stable pattern. And then Ben Kerr and Peg Riley and Mark Feldman and Brendan Bohannon followed up on this. They modified our model and did some experiments and demonstrated that this really works, that the spatial localization of interactions, which earlier you saw could select for the production of cooperators, could also select for the production of these spiteful individuals who are producing a toxin that is harming others. Now, maybe you don't want to consider that spite, but because there's an evolutionary advantage to the production of it, but it works. In general, in societies, contributions to public goods or common pool resources depend upon intrinsic prosociality, the degree of caring we may have for others that may have been shaped by evolution, reciprocal arrangements and contracts, essentially reciprocal altruism, and the development of norms and laws and taxes and other sorts of incentives. And I would argue that there's sort of a hierarchy from the bottom to the top here as these arrangements have been selected for. Most of you will know about the experiments of Ernst Fair and others. What Fair does is, in a group of this sort, is to give every individual a certain amount of resources which they can either spend on themselves or they can contribute to a public good, or they can use it at cost to themselves to punish others. Now, it's not clear why you would use it to punish others. I play this game with my class. I'm sure many of you have done the same thing, and it always works. This is a repeated game. At the end of one generation, everybody knows what everybody else has done, and so you do it again. So initially, individuals are selfish, spend it on themselves, but then they get punished. And so eventually, because humans will punish others who deviate from social norms, cooperation evolves, and punishment itself becomes a norm. And we the question of the importance of second-order norms punishing those who don't punish is one that is debated. But in any case, punishment itself certainly arises as a norm and helps to sustain the cooperative norm, and it's repeated interactions that do it. So norms are important to understand pro-social behavior. But in what's going on here, the group structure, if you have a group structure, will foster norm maintenance. In other words, if a population is broken up into groups, and those groups may develop cooperative mechanisms in order to give them an advantage in competition with other groups, but by the same token, norm maintenance itself enhances group structure. So these two things co-evolve. So the way I think these behaviors evolve is that initially, as we saw in the simulations of cooperation, individuals become associated with each other randomly, some of them cooperators, some not. But once those associations are there, those aggregates can become the pre-patterns for selection. So once you have a group of individuals who are gaining some benefit from working together, you begin to develop mechanisms that maintain the integrity of the group, that reduce interactions with other groups, and that enhance cooperative behaviors. Once you have that, you can begin to develop collective decision-making of a more sophisticated nature that helps to reinforce groups. And then once you have that, this provides the context for norms and laws and religions and other institutions to arise that help to sustain those groups and reinforce them. Now, how does evolution shape collective behaviors within these groups and decision-making and ultimately the emergence of society? Two students of mine, one a postdoc, Alessandro Tavoni and Maya Schluter, developed a model that was directed. Maya works on water removal systems in Uzbekistan, but this could apply as well to fisheries in which individuals have a common pool resource from which they're withdrawing. They can either withdraw at a low rate or they can withdraw at a high rate. Those who withdraw at a lower rate bind together, produce agreements from which they punish by ostracism the individuals who withdraw at the high rate. And I'm not going to show you the model, I'll show you the results of the model. What you see here, what we call selfishness, is the degree to which the over-consumers are withdrawing compared to what a cooperator does. So if we were down at 1, that would mean that they weren't really defectors, they're withdrawing at the same rate. If it's at 3, they withdraw 3 times the rate. And we build a replicator model where the punishment of them depends on the frequency of cooperators. So not surprisingly, this is a coordination game, because if the number of cooperators is below some threshold, you can't get cooperation started. But once you get above the threshold, there's a second cooperative equilibrium. So the question of how to get here and how to get the number of cooperators above that threshold level is the crucial one in this model, and it's also a principle that is often built into international agreements. They only go into effect if the number of cooperators is above a certain amount. One of the problems that arises here is if you have a group of individuals who ought to be cooperating, who would be better off cooperating, how do you get them to cooperate? This arises in evolutionary biology. My postdoc, Errol Akçay, who was a student of Mark Feldman's, and I and collaborators have been working on the question of how you achieve these cooperative agreements. The model here is based on a biological problem. If you have males in a population who either have the choice of looking for females individually or collectively, how do they decide which they should do? Each one of them has an outside option, that is what they could get if they operate individually. Each one of them, collectively, they have an expected payoff if they cooperate, but they both have private information. Neither one of them knows what the outside options are the other has. And so the question of whether you can achieve cooperation, and secondly, how you divide up the extra benefits, is a problem really in mechanism design. But I want to turn instead to thinking about simpler arrangements, insurance arrangements. Insurance arrangements spread risks. They create public goods and common pool resources. As an example, this is work with Avinash Dixit and Dan Rubenstein. Dan works in East Africa. In East Africa, the herdsmen have often small pieces of land and small herds of cattle. And some years, one will have good environmental conditions, and some years they'll have bad conditions. So suppose that I'm having a bad year, and you're having a good year, Francisco, and I say to Francisco, can I send my cattle to graze on your land? And Francisco says, why should I do that other than my pro-sociality? And I say, well, because next year the situation might be reversed, and you can send your cattle to graze on my land. So these arrangements, these sharing of grazing grounds, have developed as mechanisms of insurance, so that individuals can average over the uncertainty. The basic framework of our model, let's just consider the simplest case, says there are good years and bad years. We're both drawing from the same distribution. When I have a bad year and he has a good year, then I send some number of cattle, M, over to graze on his land. Each one of us is making an investment in our own good, in the private good, and in the public good, which is essentially the land. The first step in our paper is to find out what would be best if there was somebody in charge moving cattle around and trying to maximize our total welfare, which is similar to what comes up in the previous mechanism design problem. So the model, the details of this model form are not crucial, but we use a Cobb-Douglas relationship. And what this says is A1 is the quality of the conditions that Francisco experiences on his land up in Napa in a given year. A2 is what I experience. X1 is how many cattle he had. X2 is how many cattle I had. But I'm moving M of them up to his property. And so the payoff to him, the payoff on his land is A1 X1 plus M to the alpha multiplied times Z1 to the beta. That's just the form of the welfare of the utility function there. And we add those together, and then there's a cost function which is based on the investment we make. Here we've taken a quadratic cost function, but that's not crucial. So the first question we ask is, what's the optimum here? In other words, how many cattle should be moved in order to maximize this total? But then the next question is, well, what if the dictator goes away? Is this self-enforcing? Is this an arrangement that could be maintained? And that will depend on the discount rate. If the discount rate is high, then he's going to say, I don't care about next year. But if the discount rate is low, he's going to worry a great deal more about it. So you can calculate exactly what that critical discount rate would be. But what if it's not self-enforcing? Then the next question you can ask is, are there second best solutions? In other words, he says to me, well, I'm not going to accept your sending all of your cattle here. I'm not even going to accept your sending the number of cattle that would optimize our collective benefit. But you can send me 10. I could tolerate that. It wouldn't have much effect. And so the question is, what's the best solution that's self-sustaining? So this becomes a constrained optimization problem. And finally, if you allow, there are a lot of pro-social arrangements. Many of these farmers, herdsmen are related to each other, and for other reasons there is pro-sociality. As soon as you put that in, of course, it makes it easier to maintain cooperation. So Avinash and I have turned to the question of what are the consequences of pro-sociality more generally? And so this is a more general framework. And the idea is individuals are divided into groups. VGI is the utility of individual I in group G, which is a function of that individual's investment, for example, in her own cattle, and the public good, the total public good in that group, minus the cost function, plus the amount that I care about other individuals in the group. So gamma sub g is the prosociality parameter. It's very similar to inclusive fitness in evolutionary biology. So it says that my utility is increased by what your payoff is. Your cost doesn't enter into this. Everybody else is in group G, and then discounted by the amount that I care about them. So here, Z sub G is the total public good. It's, for example, the sum of the public goods of, the sum of the contributions of all the other individuals in my group. And in fact, what we've done down here is to say, and if there are other groups, there may be leakage benefits that we're getting as well. So for example, if in a particular neighborhood, people go to encounter difficulties in trying to improve the air quality in that neighborhood, there are going to be benefits that leak out to individuals in other groups. So with the structure of that model, you can optimize what the utility is with respect to the investments. And one thing that Avinash already found by considering a single group model is that public contributions can emerge because of local prosociality. But in fact, in this more complex topological network, local prosociality can produce global cooperation. And the topology of the network, not surprisingly, is important there. So prosociality plays an important role. Why is there prosociality? You know that there are lots of examples that demonstrate that individuals have regard for others and regard for norms. Errol, together with Mark and two other colleagues, wrote a paper a few years ago providing an evolutionary explanation for how other regarding behavior could evolve. And we heard Ken Brinmore talk this morning about fairness. Individuals ultimately have to embed their decisions in a broader context. That's why these norms are sustained. Why individuals will pay a price in order to support a social norm, even in a non-repeated game, because they're embedding it in a framework that's essentially a repeated game. So they develop heuristics like fairness that characterize behaviors that substitute for calculations because of bounded rationality. Historical effects, of course, may be important here, but ultimately, I think, to understand this, you have to recognize that a particular game you're playing is being selected from a broader class, and so we need a theory of metagames, and one of Brian's former students, Kevin Zollman, published a paper a few years ago, which I think was a step in this direction. So in other words, a metagame model would say, you and I are playing a game, and we don't know what game we're playing. It's being drawn from some set of possible games, maybe characterized by a matrix where the parameters are drawn from some distribution. But you have to decide on your strategy not knowing what the game is. And therefore, you're put in one particular context, and your behavior may look like it's irrational in that context, but it's evolved in a broader class. As far as I know, there's not a lot done on metagames, but Brian would know more about than I do. So let me summarize. So far, collective action can be effective if it includes enforcement. Prosociality is an important contributor to the maintenance of public goods and public common pool resources. And finally, I want to ask the question, how are collective decisions made? So voting theory is an active branch of mathematics, and it tells us what possible ways are that individuals can come together and decide what's in their common good. My student, Andrew Berdahl, and I and some others are about to publish a paper on how salmon find their way upstream. And they come to particular branches, have to decide whether to go one way or the other. And our argument is they basically vote, and it's a collective decision situation. There are these are starlings, and it's just amazing to watch. These are starlings over Rome. Oh, well, that one's a hawk there. Doug Irwin would pick that up. They're not all starlings, but they're all responding in ways to deal with this threat of the hawk. And these fantastic macroscopic patterns emerge from local decisions. Well, humans do that to some extent as well. They are responding in collective phenomena to local interactions. How do the social norms become established? What's the role of leadership? How is consensus achieved in democratic societies? And what's the role of unopinionated individuals? Ian Cousin, who was my postdoc some years ago, is now my colleague at Princeton, and I and others have been trying to understand the dynamics of bird flocks and fish schools. And in particular, recently, we've asked the question, what about all of the unwashed, the unopinionated in these societies? How important are they? So the final thing I'll talk about is a paper we published 2 years ago in Science on the importance of uninformed individuals on developing consensus. So similar conclusions here emerge from multiple angles. First of all, Ian is an experimentalist, and so he's done experiments with fish. These don't look like fish, but they represent fish, and in which they've been trained to targets. And you can not only train them to go to particular targets, you can train them to have high or low degrees of fidelity to those targets, to really be committed to go or to not care so much. Secondly, we developed analytical and simulation models of how these fish were doing that, in which each individual has a certain positional vector, which it updates in relationship to what it thinks its target is and what its neighbors are doing. And the third is to look at models of human collective decision making. So in that paper, we looked at all three of those. We first of all did experiments with golden shiners, those fish. We then looked at the results of our simulation model, and we looked at a model that was adapted from a paper by VIII, where one considers a random network with a large number of nodes. It happens to be initialized with a mean degree of 10, but then individuals change their opinions in relationship to what their neighbors are doing, and also, ultimately, individuals have a preference as well, so they're less likely to switch away from their preference. And they also, at some point, begin to make or break links with probabilities based on how similar they are to others. So there are two levels. You change your opinions with respect to what your neighbors are doing and with respect to your own preferences, and you change your topology if you realize you're hanging out with individuals that don't think like you. We also adapted a model of Peyton-Young's, which is a model of conventions, which has many similar features in which individuals, for example, trying to decide what currency to use, meet other individuals on some network and either switch to their opinions or not, but we allow these individuals to have some intrinsic preference, so it becomes a very similar structure. All of these models produce similar results. On this axis is the strength of opinion. We assume that there are a minority of individuals who want to go in direction A and a majority want to go in direction B, in addition to a large number of unopinionated individuals. But the minority hold their opinion much more strongly. And what happens is, not surprisingly, the more strongly the minority hold their opinions, the less likely the group is to go in the direction favored by the majority. But if you introduce large numbers of unopinionated individuals, that changes. It becomes harder and harder for the minority to dominate, and this is true in all of the models. As you increase the number of uninformed individuals, the probability of reaching the majority target goes up until the number of uninformed individuals or unopinionated individuals becomes so large that things become basically random. So to conclude, managing the commons is both an environmental and an evolutionary challenge. In human societies, we saw examples: mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon. Users self-organize to develop norms and institutions, to design sanctions, and to establish and maintain cooperation so that they don't overexploit resources. Societies emerge basically as multicellular organisms. It's an interesting question as to whether the composition of societies in terms of the numbers of doctors and lawyers and grocers, et cetera, is what's optimal, and if not, what's the role of government and society in creating incentives that change that distribution. But they are, to a large extent, multicellular organisms. Adam Smith said a lot of things, but he's frequently quoted in terms of the invisible hand to say that, that individuals, by promoting their own self-interest, often benefit society more effectually than if they really wanted to promote it. But he also warned against selfish individuals. And in fact, if we didn't know it before, we learned it in 2008. The invisible hand doesn't protect society by itself. One needs regulations in order to balance things out. Ecological systems and socioeconomic systems alike are complex adaptive systems. That is, they're made up of individual agents pursuing their own selfish agendas. And so, as we heard in the last presentation, that means there's an interplay between top-down mechanisms like rewards and punishments and bottom-up mechanisms like evolved prosociality and the collective action that comes about. Neither bottom-up nor top-down by itself is sufficient. So I hope I've convinced you, I don't think this group needed convincing, that indeed Darwinian approaches have a lot to tell us about social evolution. Thank you.
Are you willing to entertain some questions?